I've spent most of my life pretending to be a decent man. That's probably the easiest way to explain how I ended up forging a dead man's will. You know the type of person people trust automatically? Soft voice. Calm posture. Always remembers birthdays. Always helps carry groceries. Always sends thank you cards. That was me. William Harper. Reliable nephew. Dependable accountant. The man nobody ever looked twice at. And honestly, that image took years to build. The funny thing about trust is once people hand it to you, they stop checking your pockets. My Uncle Richard was the first person who ever taught me that. He was rich in the quiet way old men sometimes are. No sports cars, no mansion, no silk robes. Just land. Stocks. Savings accounts older than some countries. He lived alone in a weathered 2-story house outside Albany with a dying golden retriever and enough money to make relatives suddenly rediscover family values every Christmas. I wasn't close to him growing up. Nobody really was. Richard had this way of making conversations feel like tax audits. But when I turned 32 and my life started collapsing under debt, he reached out. At the time, I was drowning. I'd lost my job after gambling away money I absolutely should not have touched. Not company money, I wasn't that reckless yet, but enough personal debt to attract men who spoke softly and threatened loudly. Credit cards maxed out. Rent overdue. My ex-wife gone. Collection calls every hour. Then Richard called. Said he needed help organizing his finances because his hands were getting too shaky. I still remember the smell of his house the first day I arrived. Dust, old paper, black coffee, and dog hair. He sat me down at the kitchen table and slid folders toward me without even looking up. "You're good with numbers," he said. "Try not to screw me." That became my life for the next 2 years. I handled his accounts, paid bills, organized documents, scheduled appointments. Slowly, I became indispensable. The old man trusted me with everything: passwords, signatures, safe deposit keys. I knew where every dollar lived. And that's when I discovered the will. It wasn't hidden dramatically behind a painting or locked in a vault. It sat in a plain manila folder labeled estate. That was Richard, practical to the point of arrogance. I shouldn't have opened it. But people like me always do eventually. The will divided everything between 3 people: a distant cousin in Seattle, some environmental charity Richard never stopped talking about, and a retired neighbor named Helen who brought him soup every Thursday. I wasn't mentioned once. Not a dollar. Not even the grandfather clock I spent 6 months repairing for him. That realization hit harder than I expected. I'd convinced myself I mattered to him somehow. That all the late nights balancing accounts and driving him to doctor appointments meant something beyond convenience. Turns out I was just another employee he forgot to pay properly. I remember sitting there in his study while rain hammered the windows, staring at the signature at the bottom of the will. Richard's handwriting was elegant, deliberate, precise. And unfortunately for him, I had spent 2 years imitating it every single day. I didn't decide to forge the will immediately. People always imagine crimes happening in one dramatic moment, like a switch flips in your head and suddenly you're evil. That's not how it worked for me. It was slower. Rod is always slow. At first, I only thought about fairness. That's the dangerous word people use when they want to justify terrible things. I told myself Richard owed me. I'd sacrificed 2 years cleaning up his finances while my own life was collapsing in private. Every debt collector call, every sleepless night, every panic attack over money, all while protecting his fortune like some loyal servant. So I started paying attention. Not to the money anymore, but to the details. His handwriting. The pressure of his pen strokes. The way he formed capital letters too carefully, like every signature was a legal statement. I already signed checks for him occasionally when his arthritis got bad, always with permission. That made practice easy. Too easy. I began tracing old birthday cards at night in my apartment. Then copying grocery notes. then entire paragraphs from old letters. By the third week, even I couldn't tell the difference consistently. That realization terrified me, and thrilled me more than I want to admit. Once I realized I could reproduce Richard's handwriting convincingly, the idea stopped feeling hypothetical. It became logistical. That's another thing nobody tells you about crimes like this. They become projects. Spreadsheets. Timelines. Risk assessments. I approached forgery the same way I used to prepare tax reports for clients. Methodically. Emotionally detached. At least, that's what I pretended. The first problem was the paper. Richard's original will was drafted 8 years earlier on expensive cream-colored stationery from a legal supplier downtown. I spent 3 days tracking down the exact brand because I knew mismatched paper could destroy everything instantly under scrutiny. Then came the ink. Same model fountain pen. Same blue-black cartridge. Same slight fading around the edges after drying. I practiced aging documents using sunlight and careful exposure to cigarette smoke in my bathroom. My apartment smelled like a dying library for weeks. The forged version itself was simple. Only 2 changes. The charity's share became mine. Helen's portion stayed untouched. I couldn't bring myself to erase her completely. Funny, the tiny moral lines criminals draw for themselves. The actual swap happened on a Thursday in November. I remember because Helen had just left after bringing Richard chicken soup, and the entire house smelled like rosemary and wet wool from her coat. Richard had fallen asleep in his recliner with the television muttering some history documentary to an empty room. My pulse was so loud I could barely hear it. I'd hidden the forged will inside a financial folder earlier that day. The plan was simple: go into the study, unlock the cabinet, replace the document, leave. 5 minutes at most. But fear changes time. The moment I opened the cabinet, my hands started shaking uncontrollably. Not dramatic movie shaking either, tiny tremors that made paper edges slip against my fingers. I kept imagining Richard waking up behind me. "What are you doing, William?" I had rehearsed answers for weeks, but in that moment my mind went blank. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Not Richard. The dog. Old Baxter limped into the hallway growling softly at me like he sensed something rotten in the room. I froze completely, holding both wills in my hands like evidence waiting for police lights. That dog scared me more than any human ever did. Baxter stood in the doorway staring at me with those cloudy old eyes, growling low enough to make my stomach knot. Animals notice things people ignore. They smell fear. Guilt too, maybe. For a second, I honestly considered abandoning the whole thing. The original will was still in my left hand. The forged one sat on the desk beside the open cabinet. One movement, and I could have put everything back exactly as it was. Nobody would ever know. Then Richard coughed loudly from the living room. Instinct took over. I shoved the forged document into the folder, slid it back inside the cabinet, locked it, and stuffed the original under my jacket just as Baxter started barking. Loud. Sharp. Panicked. Richard called out weakly. "William? That you?" I walked into the living room trying to breathe normally while sweat rolled down my spine. Baxter kept barking at my feet like he was warning him. "Dog's losing his mind again," I said with a laugh that sounded fake even to me. Richard barely looked up from the television. That hurt more than it should have. After the swap, everything became unbearable. I used to think committing the crime would be the hardest part, but no, the waiting was worse. Infinitely worse. Every phone call made my chest tighten. Every unexpected letter felt dangerous. I started waking up at 3 in the morning convinced police were outside my apartment. Meanwhile, Richard just kept living. He complained about the weather. Argued with cable companies. Asked me to help reset his passwords every other week. Normal old man things. And every time I saw him, guilt twisted deeper into me because he trusted me completely. That trust became poison. Then his health started failing faster after Christmas. Hospital visits. Breathing problems. Confusion. I drove him to appointments while carrying the knowledge that I'd already stolen from his corpse before it technically existed. One afternoon in February, he grabbed my wrist unexpectedly while I helped him into bed. "You're the only one I can rely on," he said quietly. I smiled at him. Then I went into his bathroom afterward and threw up hard enough to make my ribs ache. Richard died on a rainy Tuesday morning. The call came from the hospital just after 6 a.m., and despite everything, I cried. Real tears. That's the part people may not understand. You can betray someone completely and still grieve them honestly. The funeral was small. Cold. Quiet. Helen sat in the front row clutching tissues with trembling hands. The cousin from Seattle arrived wearing an expensive black coat and the expression of someone calculating property values during prayer. I remember thinking Richard would have hated all of us standing there pretending to be noble. The reading of the will happened 3 days later at a lawyer's office downtown. That room nearly stopped my heart. Every tiny sound became unbearable, pages turning, coffee stirring, chairs creaking. I kept waiting for someone to frown or pause or say, "This signature looks strange." But they didn't. The lawyer read the document calmly while I sat there nodding at appropriate moments like some grieving relative. When my name appeared beside nearly half the estate, Helen looked surprised but not suspicious. The cousin looked furious. And somehow, that made everything feel real for the first time. The inheritance came through within months. Not all at once, of course. There were accounts to transfer, property evaluations, legal delays. But eventually the money started arriving piece by piece, and every payment felt surreal. Numbers I used to dream about while staring at unpaid bills suddenly belonged to me. I paid my debts immediately. Every collector stopped calling within a week. I moved into a better apartment with exposed brick walls and expensive silence. Bought tailored suits. Started eating in restaurants where nobody checked prices before ordering wine. And for a while, I convinced myself I'd won. That's the ugly truth. Guilt fades surprisingly fast when your electricity stays on and your bank account stops terrifying you. I slept better. Smiled more. Even looked healthier. Friends who disappeared during my broke years suddenly returned pretending they'd always cared. But paranoia grows alongside comfort. I became obsessed with tiny details. I avoided discussing Richard entirely. Kept the original will locked inside a fireproof box under my bed like cursed evidence. Sometimes I'd take it out at night just to stare at it. Proof that my entire new life rested on one lie. Everything began unraveling because of Helen. Not lawyers. Not police. Not handwriting experts. A retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and sensible shoes. About 6 months after Richard's death, she invited me over for tea. I almost declined, but refusing would have seemed suspicious, so I went. Her house smelled like cinnamon candles and old books, the kind of place where people confess things accidentally. At first, the conversation felt harmless. Memories about Richard. Stories about his stubbornness. Complaints about how empty the neighborhood felt without him. Then she asked one simple question. "Did Richard ever mention changing the will to you?" My throat tightened instantly. I tried to sound casual. "Not specifically." "Why?" Helen stirred her tea slowly without looking at me. "Because he once told me he didn't trust family with money. Said charities were safer than people." That sentence hit me like cold water. I laughed it off somehow. Said maybe illness changed his perspective near the end. Helen nodded politely, but I noticed something unsettling afterward. She watched me too carefully for the rest of the evening. Like a teacher waiting for a student to stop lying. 2 weeks after visiting Helen, I got a call from Richard's lawyer asking me to come downtown to clarify a few estate matters. Nobody says things like that casually. The moment I entered his office and saw a stranger sitting beside him with a leather briefcase and wire-rimmed glasses, my entire body went cold. The man introduced himself as a forensic document examiner. I honestly don't remember the next few seconds clearly. My hearing narrowed into this dull underwater ringing while my brain tried calculating escape routes that didn't exist. Apparently, the cousin from Seattle had contested the will, claimed Richard lacked mental clarity near the end, and demanded authentication of recent documents. Which meant the signature. Which meant me. The examiner asked calm, harmless-sounding questions while studying me more than the paperwork. Had Richard's hands been steady lately? Did he frequently revise legal documents? Did I ever assist him with signatures due to arthritis? That last question nearly broke me. I answered carefully. Too carefully, probably. When the meeting ended, the lawyer thanked me politely, but the examiner held my gaze a second longer than normal. Like he already knew, and was waiting for me to panic first. After that meeting, I stopped functioning like a normal person. Every stranger felt like surveillance. Every unknown number became a potential investigator. I started checking behind me while walking home, convinced someone was building a case quietly in the background. Then panic pushed me into making the dumbest decision of my life. I tried to destroy the original will. For months, I'd kept it hidden under my bed because some irrational part of me believed I needed control over the truth. But once the handwriting expert got involved, that document transformed from insurance into a loaded weapon pointed at my chest. So one night around 2 a.m., I drove outside the city toward an abandoned campground Richard used to mention. I brought lighter fluid, matches, gloves, the whole paranoid criminal starter kit. But fear makes people sloppy. A state trooper noticed my car parked near the woods and stopped to investigate. Suddenly I was standing there in freezing darkness holding a metal tin containing a dead man's original will while trying to explain why I smelled like gasoline. I thought my life ended right there. Somehow, unbelievably, it didn't. The trooper shined his flashlight directly into my face while I stood there trying not to collapse. He asked what I was burning. My mind went completely blank. Not metaphorically, genuinely blank. It felt like somebody unplugged every thought in my head at once. Then instinct took over before logic could catch up. I found letters from my uncle, I said quietly. He died recently. I just didn't want anyone reading them. The officer's expression changed immediately. Sympathy is terrifying when you don't deserve it. He looked into the tin but never unfolded the documents completely. The original will sat buried beneath old receipts and random papers I'd thrown in last minute. Pure luck saved me. Nothing more sophisticated than that. After a long silence, he handed the container back and told me open fires weren't allowed there anymore. Then he said something that still bothers me. Grief makes people do strange things. Go home, all right? Grief. Not greed. Not fraud. Not theft. I drove back shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. That night I realized something awful. I wasn't scared of prison anymore. I was scared of becoming someone irreversible. A month later, Helen came to my apartment unannounced. The second I opened the door and saw her standing there holding her purse tightly against her chest, I knew something had changed. People carry certainty differently. More stillness. Less hesitation. She didn't sit down when I invited her in. Instead, she looked around my apartment quietly, the expensive furniture, the view, the polished kitchen counters, all bought with Richard's money. I could practically see her adding things up in her head. Then she asked me directly, "Did you forge that will, William?" No anger. No shouting. That somehow made it worse. I denied it immediately, of course. Too quickly. My voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and we both heard it. Helen stared at me for a long moment with tears forming in her eyes. "I knew Richard for 30 years," she said softly. "He would never have changed his mind like that without telling me." I wanted to confess right there. Honestly, I did. But survival instinct is stronger than guilt most of the time. So I kept lying while this kind old woman looked at me like she was watching someone drown themselves deliberately. In the end, nothing happened. That's probably the most unsettling part of this story. The cousin from Seattle eventually ran out of money for legal challenges. The handwriting expert concluded there were minor irregularities, but not enough evidence to prove deliberate forgery conclusively. Richard's arthritis apparently explained inconsistencies well enough to create reasonable doubt. And Helen? She stopped speaking to me completely. No dramatic confrontation. No police report. She just disappeared from my life like a door quietly closing forever. Somehow that hurt more than being arrested would have. A year later, the investigation officially died. I remember sitting alone in my apartment after getting confirmation from the lawyer, waiting to feel relief. Freedom. Victory. Instead, I felt hollow. Because once the fear vanished, all I had left was myself. And I hated that person. The money no longer felt exciting after that. It became contaminated somehow. Every expensive thing I bought carried Richard's voice underneath it. Every comfort reminded me of betrayal. People think getting away with a crime means escaping consequences. They imagine consequences are always legal. They're not. Sometimes they move into your head and stay there permanently. It's been 11 years since Richard died. I still have the money. Most of it, anyway. Investments multiplied it over time, which feels almost cruelly poetic. The lie kept earning interest long after everyone stopped asking questions. But here's the truth nobody tells you about crimes like mine. You don't escape them. You absorb them. At some point, the forgery stopped being a document and became part of my identity. I started measuring every relationship differently after that. Every compliment felt undeserved. Every act of trust made me uncomfortable. When people call me a good man now, there's always this ugly pause inside my head before I answer. Because I know exactly what I'm capable of. If anyone reading this thinks desperation justifies crossing certain lines, listen carefully. Once you rewrite another person's final wishes, you start rewriting yourself too. Piece by piece. And eventually you become someone even you wouldn't trust. That's the punishment nobody sees. Not prison. Not exposure. Living the rest of your life knowing one quiet moment of greed permanently separated you from the person you used to believe you were.